Look at her. Even at her old age, she's still beautiful. Still holding it together. And, unless you're a flat earth lunatic, still maintaining her signature round curves that we cannot deny. In our planet's 4.5 billion trips around the sun, it's estimated she's had an unbelievable 1,643,500,000,000 revolutions. All kinds of revolutions. Some of them good, some not so good. And only with time, or having even a basic value and respect for individual freedom and property rights, might one tell which revolutions are which. But inevitably, with any revolution, we come to ask, was it worth it? And so it is with the Industrial Revolution, with its mechanization, mass production, mass migration, mass consumption and urbanization, the most important changes in human social evolution since subsistence farming and the domestication of animals. But was the Industrial Revolution worth it? To answer that, you had to be there. Revolution, from the Latin to revolve or roll back, giving us its current meaning, a forcible overthrow. And yes, whether in matters of state or rock and roll, revolutions are often violent. The Industrial Revolution, powered first by water, then steam, and alien technology, brought forth machine tools and the mechanized factory, the early necessary components to contemporary civilization. And naturally, everyone has tried to get in on the trend. But as it is with most things, early on, the first people to get it were the cool people. From the Northern Hemisphere, in Western Europe. Starting in Great Britain when it was actually great, the Industrial Revolution raged between about 1760 and, say, 1820 to 1840. Now that we know the where and the when of the Industrial Revolution, one could easily make logical leaps, going from rural migration filling urban textile mills, to the fashion industry, to gay culture, to secret gay show business, and finally, to Bob Saget's brutal gay killer. But I've got another 8 minutes to kill myself. Wait, Bob Saget's brutal gay killer. But I've got another 8 minutes to kill... But I've got another 8 minutes to kill myself. So we'll take a longer route. But first, a brief shout out to a revolutionary OG, the Agricultural Revolution. The Ag Rev, with its new methods of farming, produced surplus crops for market, and surplus farmers, who in mobs of mostly white trash provided the labor needed for industrial methods which were wiping out the old ways. But I'm jumping ahead, like someone seems to have done to Bob Saget. In times of old, most stuff hadn't been invented yet. Back then, the sad truth was if you wanted something, you'd probably have to make it. Those who figured out how to make stuff, you know, men, would hang their shingle and sell their services to others, becoming local craftsmen. The blacksmith, gunsmith, silversmith, locksmith, clocksmith, and others. Most townspeople were smiths of one kind or another, and each was revered and celebrated for their highly skilled handwork. In larger villages hummed a small service economy of clerks, barkeeps, and prostitutes, commonly known as wienersmiths. In fact, most people were actually named Smith, which had a profound effect on the pre-industrial courting pool. For all a fella knew, he might very well be sharing his wedding bed with a cousin. The kind of behavior he thought he'd left back on the farm. In the days before the Industrial Revolution, a wife might, if she knew what's good for her, make and mend her family's clothes. Her sewing, knitting, and weaving often done with a group of other chatterboxes, allowing her to gossip with friends and relatives about the latest techniques in churning and who must be shunned. Their husbands, the craftsmen of the day, eventually came to the realization that if they wanted a way to end this, a way to escape, they'd have to make it. Clearly what they needed was some alien tech, in this case, a flying shuttle. But in 1733, Englishman John Kay came up with a workaround. The flying shuttle on his new loom eliminated the need for a second person to pass the shuttle through the threads by hand, which meant a lady didn't need her friend hanging around to do her chores. The faster looms created a greater demand for more thread. Another Englishman, James Hargreaves, solved that problem with this: the spinning jenny. She may not look like much, but this contraption was 8 times more efficient at spinning thread than a single woman, and with far less breakdowns. First powered by hand, then water wheel and steam engines, the spinning jenny would bring about an explosion in the demand for cotton yarn. changing forever the lives of countless Europeans and a few million people from the less cool parts of the globe. Though they're long past their days of utility, you might still find a spinning jenny pop up on an adult entertainment site. Nevertheless, the Industrial Revolution had begun. And as often occurs with revolutions that don't require armed conflict, as in art, fashion, and rock and roll, some of the earliest to get hip to the Industrial Revolution were women. You might even say girls. Making the most of their new independence as women, one could say the textile industry is their second oldest profession. And though it may not have paid as much, the only person touching you might be your shift manager. But for that, you had to be pretty. Or pretty enough. In North America, factories began popping up all over New England, where there were plenty of rivers for power and white people. Cities began to grow as people rapidly left their farms for wage work. And why wouldn't they? What man wants to chop wood all alone to heat his home or fire his kiln, when for $1.83 a day he could earn his bread in some dark hole in the ground, choking for air and digging coal with a bunch of dudes, away from all the yapping the sewing bee was kicking up at home? A new life in a new place was welcomed by most. Who would want to die getting kicked by a horse on some dirt farm when given the chance of living in a world-class city and dying getting kicked by a horse? Rapidly expanding production enticed many to move to new cities for jobs, including all manner of immigrants, who would have otherwise, no doubt, just been hanging around, menacing our women with their olive oil voices and their Guinea charm. Along the banks of Pennsylvania's rivers, steel production would spring forth after the industry was revolutionized with the Bessemer process, which came along with perfect timing for the mills to swallow up the teeming immigrants from Ireland, Poland, and worse places, most of whom were indeed revolting before they'd even arrived on our shores. Urbanization had the effect of bringing many disparate people together to exchange the latest news, thoughts, dance crazes, and diseases. It was certainly more easy to get comfortable with one's presuppositions about your bohunks and your Lugans when there was a noisy family of them in the tenement right below you. But the effect of immigration and industrialization was clear. The price of producing lace fell from an arm and a leg to no more than maybe a wrist or an elbow, providing someone heard your screams in time to shut off the machine. In fact, slowing down production for a personal matter was frowned upon as very bad form and might justifiably get one fired, with the only severance being to your dominant hand. Then back you'd go to being a wienersmith. So naturally, early industrial workers took their jobs seriously. Though they received little in actual pay, they knew they had a vested interest in not getting too close to the steam press. In fact, the shame befalling any worker who slowed the revolution was so strong among the laboring class, many chose rather than to stop production to allow themselves to be crushed to death by the gears of mighty capitalism. At least that's what we presume they chose. Most of the time, these things happened much too fast to ask. Even the slower accidents quickly became little more than crying out for loved ones. One well-known industrial tragedy was the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, in which 146 people died, mostly teen girls trapped inside the factory because the exit doors were chained shut. Many jumped 10 stories to their death. The factory's owners evaded charges of negligent manslaughter, but did pay out compensation to the victims' families, a whopping $75 per person. But all was not lost for the owners because the insurance company paid them a rate of nearly $400 per person. So sure, there were a few hiccups to industrialization. But as often happens in the wake of any revolution, the fervor dies down and complacency sets in. In fact, by the 1980s, Pennsylvania steelworkers had stopped going to the mills, which is probably for the best since they closed in the 70s. The revolution that began in textiles and clothing was later accessorized with a rust belt. And today, many are compelled to ask, aside from giving us some last names other than Smith, was the revolution worth it? Well, consider that the Industrial Revolution is intimately connected, for better or worse, to both the Great Depression and the end of slavery. Thanks to technology, the days of brown people picking cotton in the sun by hand to support a textile industry are gone. To India, where they'd always belonged. And lest we forget, without the Industrial Revolution, Bob Saget might still be alive. But at its core, a revolution is a turning back, a coming around. With industrialism and urbanization having run their course, many in our great country are considering leaving our big cities to buy a farm. In fact, in recent years, the rates of people buying the farm in cities has skyrocketed. For a true measure of whether the Industrial Revolution was worth it, one must understand that during that time, working in a factory was so exhilarating, thousands would lie down every night in a bunk next to a stranger just for the hope of getting up the next day and doing it again for another 14 hours, which is why you had to be there. Thanks for hanging out to the end. I'm headed to the after party. Follow the link right up there. And do me a favor, leave a comment, subscribe. Dr. Gary says it's important that I attach my self-worth to a questionable metric.